God just encountered this person. God did his thing. But there's a space for us to come alongside now and say, how do we capitalize on their experience to then encourage them to go out and share their experience with others?
Welcome to Divine Renovation's Missional Leadership Podcast. Here's your host, Tammy LeBlanc.
Hi, friends. Welcome to another, what I hope is going to be a great discussion. We've kind of mixed up our recording schedule this week, so I don't typically get to hang with you guys midweek to do this. It's usually at the end of sometimes a tiring week, so it's great to be connected here on a Wednesday. I had kind of a fun event happen last week, which again, on a Tuesday night, doesn't really happen. I was supposed to go out and run my errands on top of what kind of feels like a heavy week. And my husband texted, asked me if we wanted to go see a concert at our big center here in Halifax. In the light of fun, we decided to throw caution to the wind and go to see this concert. My daughter came with us, my sister came with us, and my parents. So it was quite a family outing. Are you guys familiar with the band Boney M? I'm seeing a lot of
can't say that I am, although I'm starting to take guesses as to what even the possible style of music would be. But anyways, that's probably a whole other conversation.
I don't even want to guess. I have not, Tammy. They are not on my playlist.
They haven't made it to Texas yet, huh, Matt?
Maybe they have. I don't know. About to find out.
To give you an idea of how old this band is, I can remember as a kid, my parents listening to them on their record players. So this is what I remember them listening to. And it was catchy music. And so I did catch on, and I still have memories of some of their music. It's kind of like a mixture of disco and Caribbean, and I would say even some gospel in there. Anyway, we show up, and boy, what a surprise. What a fun time we had, dancing and singing and waving our phone lights in the air. And it was just a real blast. And it just got me thinking about how important it is to make space in our lives for fun. So how about you guys? You got any unexpected fun or joy in your life, or maybe even some planned fun? What's going on in your lives now?
Some of our listeners might not be aware of this, but those at Divine Renovation been listening to me whine about having my basement flooded last summer here after bad rains. And so my fun has been drywalling and crack filling as I replace the damage. And this week, if it's a super fun week, I'll be putting flooring down. I joke, I am actually looking forward to possibly having some of this behind me. I don't know if that's what you had in mind, Tammy, when you're asking about fun, but right now, that's the extent of my definition of fun in my world.
Rob, I think what could make it more fun is, why don't you download that band, Boney M? Is that what you just called them?
Yes. You can rock out while you're putting up your drywall.
Listen while you put drywall. That's what I'm picturing right now.
There we go.
How do I compete with that? I don't have fun then, if that's what the definition of fun.
All right. What's bringing you joy these days, Matt?
Well, I tell you, as my kids have gotten older, my youngest is now 10, which is just another phase of life. But my oldest is about to go to college. So this is a really special year for us, because I feel like we're trying to get it all in, or I'm trying to relish every moment, or I'm trying to hit the pause button so the year doesn't get away from us. But I love watching my kids shine. I love watching what they do when they love it. And I'll tell you one thing I love to do down here in Texas, and maybe this doesn't play with a whole global audience, but we love when we have time off over the holidays at the end of each year to go hunting. And that's a lot of fun and joy for my kids too.
Yes, I've seen some of those joy-filled pictures with the catch in hand.
That's right. That's right.
Well, as a former hunter, I can appreciate that, but I haven't hunted in a number of years now.
And I have never hunted, sorry.
Come to Texas. I will take you out.
Come to Halifax, and maybe you'll get to hear Boney M.
Yeah.
And put up drywall. I can't wait. I'll be there in a few months. So I'm looking forward to being with you all in person as well.
All right, guys, as I try to pull this conversation in the direction of evangelization, So evangelization for us is a very big topic, so big that it's one of our 3 keys towards renewal. So we speak into it a lot. Today's conversation is not going to be focused so much around what evangelization is, but rather taking a stand back at what you're doing and making sure that you're providing the right energy towards evangelization, making sure that you're continuing to prioritize it, and maybe making sure that your structure is supporting your evangelization efforts. Matt, can you kind of set a framework for us of what we mean by evangelization?
Yeah, sure. And I do think the fun we had at the beginning is a great lead in, actually, Tammy, because we talk about the church. There's so many ancient parts of the church. There's so many beautiful traditions in the church. There's so much truth in the church. One effort in the church is to safeguard that and to proclaim it boldly and truthfully and clearly to people. And all of that is very true, and it's still the same in the church. So when we start talking about this idea of evangelization, it's not like we're throwing out the old, or, you can still go to a Boney M concert. You can kind of harken back to the days of like the old things that we liked, even the nostalgia. And I'm not saying just all the things in the church that are ancient are nostalgic, but they do bring us back to a time when, or they remind us of when we were on our own journey of, maybe conversion or discovering truth. So those things are good. But I think what we've gotten into here is maybe sometimes we're stuck in the record players, we're stuck in the old bands, we're stuck in the ways that maybe aren't allowing us to explore how do we introduce new people. So I haven't asked you yet, Tammy, but I'm betting at the concert, were you one of the youngest people there, or was there a bunch of families there?
So it's pretty cool because it was such a mixture. I think the singer acknowledged that probably there was a lot of grandparents in the audience. So she invited the kids up on stage, so the grandkids actually, to sing. And there were quite a number of little kids. So it is a band that, if you have the opportunity to listen to them, does span multiple generations. Yeah.
Although still, you notice the target audience is the grandparents.
Yeah.
If we're honest in our churches, isn't the target audience still the grandparents? We might not be able to name it or admit that, but when we still have our target audience being the ones that have always been around, this is actually framing up for us the reason behind evangelization. And by the way, evangelization's not new. It's actually how this church got started. So we're trying to get back to this apostolic move of evangelization. Evangelization meaning going out, going beyond, where we're comfortable. And the modern popes have been echoing this. Pope Paul VI wrote a document in 1975, the year I was born, probably just after Boney M had their first #1 hit. So in 1975, Pope Paul VI wrote a document called Evangelii Nuntiandi. And in it, he said the church exists to evangelize. Now, I don't know if most people know that the church exists to evangelize, but what does it mean, right? Like we talk about this word evangelization, there's a lot of confusion. That's why I love Rob's kind of energy around this. I love Rob's clarity. I love his passion around evangelization, because it's actually, when we call it one of the 3 keys, it's the primacy of evangelization. We talk about it. So maybe just a quick flyover about like trying to get on the same page about what we're talking about. Evangelization is not catechesis. It's not forming of disciples. It's not a program or a course, and it's not reserved just for church professionals. We actually see evangelization as bringing the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's called the good news. So bringing the gospel to others in a way that invites them to make a choice to follow Jesus and then to become disciples. So this is more in the making of disciples world than the forming them. That's how it's different than catechesis. Catechesis, the truth, echoing the faith, is vitally important to disciples. But before they're disciples, we want them to make a life-changing decision when the gospel is presented to them by someone who's living it out in their own life in a way that their lives have changed. So the new person, not yet a disciple, can become a disciple.
Because I think as soon as everything becomes evangelization, nothing is evangelization. right? And there tends to be this way of labeling things evangelization, either if it's new or, well, let's just call it evangelization. And if you lack that distinction, you're going to lack the intentionality, and you're never going to see it happen. In parish renewal, and as pastors are trying to lead, leadership teams are trying to lead, the hardest thing to see happen is evangelization. And I think once you get busy and once you get moving, the easiest thing to let drop off is evangelization. And so coming back and understanding that you've got clarity on what it is that you're trying to do, you're focused on it, and you're actually restructuring around what it is you're doing so that it has that primacy. It is front and center in the way that it needs to be in order for it to happen in our parishes and to see people to come into relationship with Jesus.
So, Rob, for parishes that are kind of early into the journey, can you break down that a bit more to help us understand what it looks like to restructure for evangelization?
Yeah.
Cool. This is going to be 6 parts, and it's going to make you mad, and they're going to people send us hate mail. So, ladies and gentlemen, get out your notepads. This is your first response to Rob McDowell. So get ready to write it down and send it to us.
Give us the flyby version, Rob.
Don't talk as long as you normally talk. That's kind of what that meant. Yeah, I mean, initially, one of the things that you want to do coming out of the gate, if you want to see parish renewal, is to get evangelization going. Again, we talk so often about Alpha as the preferred tool as how that happens best in parishes. But what will end up happening is there's so much that's going on inside the parish. It's so busy, right? Priests show up all the time, and they're working 60, 70, sometimes 80 hours a week, and staff, volunteers, things like that, they're already going. And then all of a sudden we come along and say, hey, start doing this, right? And so in order for evangelization to happen, you've got to be willing to step back, and you've got to be able to look at how you're prioritizing your time, how you're prioritizing your resources, church calendar, how the priest is prioritizing their time, things like that, and step back in order to, first of all, make space for evangelization to be happening in the life of your parish. I think I may have said this one other time. If you don't get evangelization right, it doesn't matter what else you get right. Parish renewal, discipleship, everything hinges on getting evangelization right. It has to begin with recognizing that the parish needs space, leaders need space in order for that to happen. And unless you're willing to restructure and reprioritize the resources, the time and energy of people in the parish, it's not going to happen, and it's not going to happen long term. And even for parishes, sometimes they start running Alpha and they see some good things happen initially to run, quote unquote, a program once is fine. But then if you want to see that permanent change, you want to see that culture change, it's probably not going to be sustainable to just keep adding and adding, right? You've got to be willing to step back and look at everything that you're doing, and look at everything you're doing through the lens of fruitfulness and fruitfulness around evangelization, and beginning to refocus and restructure and reprioritize how you're moving forward. I'm sure there's maybe some other questions in there, but it's a minor miracle that I kept that to as short as I did.
That was perfect, Rob. That was the perfect soundbite. I think maybe just to remind us too, is many of our listeners are already have rolled up their sleeves and are doing some sort of evangelization, or trying to wrestle with it, or trying to tweak their structure a little bit, or add an evangelization process like Alpha, or talk about it more, or try and define it. That's good. But I think today, we will spend some more time talking about, how to actually look at those structures. But just one thing to keep in mind here is typically evangelization makes the insiders more uncomfortable than the outsiders. Like when we start doing evangelization or talking about it, it makes all the insiders of the church more uncomfortable. And why is that? Because the people outside the church, or the people out of a relationship with Jesus, or the people that have fallen away from the church, whatever category we put them in, those that are not experiencing the transformational life of Jesus in the church right now. Evangelization doesn't make them uncomfortable. It makes us insiders uncomfortable, because we have the church right where we want it. And we don't want it to change because it's working for us. The problem is the church is the only organization or institution that exists for the sake of those that are not yet her members. So if we have an outward-oriented mission to the outsider, it's going to mean we've got to get uncomfortable. And a lot of times, I can say this as a former church employee, this is somebody that worked at a big Catholic church. When we start messing with structures, it makes people that work for the church uncomfortable too. Not just the people that are comfortably in their pews, but also the people that work for a church. Like I worked at a big parish in Texas. There's a lot of employees at the church. I mean, I think, in the heyday, there was probably 40 that were not, that were like ministerial employees that worked at the church. Well, if you start messing with structures, you're messing with people's routines, their livelihoods, their identity in the church. Like you're messing around with that too. So this changing structure is hard. What we have down pat in the church is just adding something else, like another record to your collection, rather than looking at how does this actually become primary, right? How do you, what did we say earlier? We were talking about like evangelization. How do you make evangelization the structure around which you work rather than a piece that you add to your structure?
So I'm thinking in my head of an example. You can let me know, Matt, if this kind of falls in line with what you're saying. So something that the church does regularly is the sacrament of first reconciliation, first communion. Mm-hmm. So those are typically practices in place where there's some sort of formation leading up to the sacrament. Is there space in the Catholic Church to make those opportunities of evangelization?
Yes, but that's typically our approach in the church is let's take all of our existing structures and give them a little tweak or a facelift or make something else also important. Because even those sacraments of initiation presuppose that the person has said, I want to follow Jesus and live it out in the church. So instead of us trying to back up and look at this through the lens of evangelization, like how do we onboard new disciples? And if they then enter the church, they're going to enter it sacramentally through reconciliation and communion. Let's just take where we've lived for so long, reconciliation, communion, make those evangelization-ish, right? So that's the balance there. Yes, what my hope would be is if you can start to create evangelization as the primary lens through which you see all of your activity, then those activities would become more evangelization driven. But normally what happens is we look at our typical structures and we're not willing to invest that way. We'd rather say like, okay, well, let's make these things dressed up a little bit more so they have an evangelization element to them. Great start, but it is not the lens through which we want to see creating a culture of evangelization at your parish, which does require changes in structures.
I remember Father James saying years ago that anything can be evangelistic, but not everything is evangelization. I think all of our structures can start to have elements of things of how it helps people in the process. Like a lot of churches would say that funerals can be evangelistic, right? So you've got people that are unchurched that are coming in and things like that. And we would say, sure, there's stories that's exposing people to a church. They're coming inside the building, things like that. There may be someone that said, I went to so-and-so's funeral and I started going back to church after that. That's evangelistic, but that's not evangelization, right? And so to recognize and see where the opportunities are and to take advantage of them is slightly different than saying, no, this is what we're doing for the sole purpose of evangelization. So,
that's so good.
I don't know if that's a little bit of what you were trying to get at earlier, Matt.
Yeah.
But differentiating between what has the ability to connect people versus what's solely focused on connecting people.
That's so good. It's so good. Yes, because what you'll hear a lot in the church, right, is you have the one story of the one person who came to a funeral and started coming back to church. I'm not downplaying that. That is one soul that heaven is rejoicing over returning.
Yeah.
But to call that a strategy to build out for everybody else, you don't build strategies around great examples of conversion.
Yeah.
In the Bible, you don't see a great strategy around God visiting a bunch of people on different roads and knocking them blind off their horses, right? It worked for St. Paul, but that wasn't the strategy. You know, he created a different strategy by taking those 12 apostles and launching them out of the upper room.
Yeah, no, good point.
So for parishes who are wrestling in this strategy space right now, probably the clearest or the most easiest thing that we would recommend is to start Alpha. But I don't necessarily want to go down that path so much. I want to hear some stories and examples from you guys of parishes who have a larger strategic plan for evangelization and are doing it well, so it extends beyond Alpha.
Yeah, I would just start with saying that Alpha isn't a strategy. It can be part of your strategy, but a lot of times what people need is to have something, an event, a program, a platform to invite people to. So it lets you start like touching, feeling, sensing what it's like to evangelize. So evangelization at a basic starting point can be invitation, right? It doesn't stop there. Can't just be you invited someone and I did evangelization. But it's a starting point, and invitation needs to be part of a culture of evangelization. So Alpha can be the holding place for that. So it's like, okay, don't build out a strategy and have it all figured out, but start something like Alpha. Have a placeholder in your programs, because we like programs. Have a placeholder in your programs at the parish that is different than the Bible studies, the sacramental preps, the things for deeper water things. Have a placeholder for people to invite their unchurched, non-churched, formerly churched friends. And then start seeing the fruit and telling the stories of people coming to faith to help give you like, oh, okay, the proof. I see how it's possible to build this out, to make it more than just Alpha. This would be great if this was the direction our whole parish went in. And then a strategy can kind of unfold. Mm-hmm. Rob, would you say it the same way?
I think, first of all, it begins with just even changing your mindset. First of all, changing the mindset of the pastor around, elevating this, speaking into it, making space for it. And yeah, Matt, encouraging some of that stuff that you're talking to around pre-evangelization issues, around connecting with people, around invitation, around celebrating it. Because it's not about, just running a program. It's about understanding how we're trying to fundamentally shift the culture of the parish around some of these things. And so there tends to be a little bit of sometimes when parishes move forward in this, there's a little bit of a tension, because the pastor can't be the one to do all the evangelization, but the pastor has to be the one that owns it and begins to champion it, at least from a vision perspective, and own it in whatever way he can. A lot of times there's that right-hand person that's probably the evangelism champion that's executing it and driving it. They're the ones that are kind of overseeing the day-to-day stuff, whether they're running Alpha, whether they're trying to bring hospitality strategies in, whether they're trying to support other things that are taking place. But so it has to happen at kind of both the vision level, the pastor encouraging it, speaking into it, owning it through his own examples and stories and things like that. But then also from the standpoint of prioritizing it in as far as what leaders are leading it, whether that's a key volunteer, whether that's a staff person, recognizing again that it has to undergird and influence not just this one program that we're doing or not just this one event, but it shapes our thinking, influences our culture, and fundamentally changes how we communicate and interact with people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Tammy, you asked for like an example. Maybe I can put two parishes side by side and tell you this observable example that maybe others could relate to, especially if they're running an evangelization process like Alpha. But there's this smaller country parish in the middle of the United States. Put a pin in the middle of the United States, roughly there. They have hundreds of people coming to Mass on a weekend. But in their 6 years of running Alpha, they've had like 15,000 people come through.
Wow.
There's a gigantic church in the south of the United States where thousands of people are coming to church on the weekend. And they've had hundreds of people come through in the same period of time. So what's the difference, right? I mean, if this was scalable by size, we'd say that one is over delivering and one is under delivering. And while numbers don't tell the whole picture, they're indicators, right? It's just an indicator to say one has prioritized it in a different way than the other. For one, it's like driven through their pastor. He doesn't do all the organization, but he is championing it. He is leading it. It has become something that is normalized in their parish. And the other, at the larger parish, is still a program run by a department with one person employed to oversee it. It's a nice add-on to their cruise ship, but it has not become the destination for that cruise ship.
Rob, you have another parish too that you shared a story about that echoes what Matt is saying. Pastor who you've been coaching for quite a number of years and had Alpha running in his program, but hadn't attended himself. You finally convinced him to attend, and it opened to his eyes, right? To all of a sudden what can happen when people are evangelized. Then the question back to you was like, Rob, I got to get people to go to Alpha. How do I get more people to attend Alpha? Is that how it went?
Yeah, pretty similar to that. Yeah, it was, I remember I hadn't connected with this guy for a little while, and it was January of a new year. And it was like the first week, which normally nobody ever books coaching sessions the first week of January. And anyways, so he says, we've got a leadership summit coming up with our leaders. We're doing a training day, and I need to tell them all to take Alpha now. How do I do that? And anyways, and I'm like, hold it. Like, this was like his opening question. We didn't unpack how Christmas or Advent went, anything like that. We hadn't touched base for a couple of months. He attended Alpha himself and had a powerful experience, and it just changed him. And coming out of that, he just like, I want this change for everybody. From that day forward, how he led was completely different. And all of a sudden it wasn't like, okay, this is a part of what we do here, and we've got to kind of pump people through. No. All of a sudden now, this was something he wanted every parishioner in his church to experience. It was a surprising and very powerful moment in the life of his leadership.
Isn't that, Rob, that's a perfect example of like a flip of a switch for evangelization. When we have experienced something we want someone else to experience, that's like at its core what's happening in evangelization, from the heart of one believer to another. And what we're trying to do now really is like structure or orient around that, right? Because we need some strategies. It can't just be, well, this worked for me, so it'll work for you. Well, you came to a funeral and met Jesus, so everybody's going to meet Jesus at a funeral. Well, someone always meets Jesus at a funeral, but it might not be the people sitting in the pews. Can people look at their current structures and say, like, how do I even know if I'm structured around evangelization? How do I know where to start? What's going to be an indicator that I've got it prioritized right, or it's still just an add-on? And I think there's two ways I think we should look at. And one is just the basic church bulletin, if you still do a church bulletin. You can tell a lot about what a parish prioritizes by looking at their bulletin. I think it says as much about the fact that they don't prioritize one thing over another. It's given space because it's happening at the church, right? It's like a play-by-play of the week at a parish. And most parishes feel like that's exactly why we put it together. They'll alphabetize it, or they'll run it by days of the week, but nothing gets a different priority in the bulletin, even the ads, right? Or even outside groups, like right alongside all the other stuff. So that shows the people that are coming to us, or that are our target audience, what we prioritize. And often it's nothing. We just do it all. The second thing is how our parish staffs, if you have a parish staff, is structured. Or if you don't, the ministries that you're facilitating, even with volunteers or non-paid staff, how are those established? Like, if you wrote them all down in a column, would these be more about forming disciples, or would they be more about making disciples? And the overabundance, the overinvestment that the church is actually showing you by how she is staffed, or how she's run and facilitated, if it's not a staff, whether it's more forming or making disciples, it tells you a lot about where the priority or lack of priority for evangelization actually is.
Yeah. Or look at the budget. What are the budget lines? Where does the majority of the budget money go? Things along those lines as well.
Yeah.
You don't have to be around a church very long to really find out what it really values. Now, I say that there are some pastors that are probably on the front end that are starting to change things, that are getting a vision, heading in the right direction. If you showed up to their parish, they haven't probably changed enough things yet. You wouldn't start to get that. But over time, to what we're speaking to would certainly be a reality. In the Divine Renovation Guidebook, it talks about, we highlight 5 systems that we got from Rick Warren: ministry, fellowship, discipleship, worship, and evangelization. And it's always an interesting exercise. I will have churches go through and list all of their ministries under those 5 categories, and figure out whatever the ministry's primary things, because some ministries will cover on more than one occasionally, but every ministry kind of has a primary purpose, and have them do an audit,
right,
of all of their ministries. What's discipleship, what's fellowship, what's worship, all that sort of stuff, what's ministry, and have them categorize it and audit it. And it's interesting, particularly churches that are kind of new on the journey. Fellowship and discipleship and worship, tend to be really, really high. Sometimes a little bit of ministry, and very rarely is there anything under evangelization. And so you just start to see how top heavy you are in the different things that you're doing in your different programs and your different systems and processes, things like that. And it's always interesting to see how visual that awakens people to where their priorities actually are in the church.
In my head, listening to you guys, I'm kind of wrestling a bit with the listeners who are thinking that maybe a human strategy is, I don't know what the right word is. I don't want to say in competition, but like, if God wants to touch hearts, then God will do that. And so when we start to use our human terminologies, like we use strategy, are we still leaving space for God? And what occurred to me when I was listening to you, Matt, was you were talking about people encountering Jesus through Alpha, but then bringing strategy into play where, God just encountered this person. God did his thing, but there's a space for us to come alongside now and say, how do we capitalize on their experience to then encourage them to go out and share their experience with others, and creating that space? And so another strategy, I guess, is just tilling the soil, right? How are we making the ground fertile for people to have these encounters?
Well, I think there's 2 things going on there. One is to make the ground fertile, right? To set it up where you're giving yourself the best opportunity for the gospel to be transmitted, and to do it in a way that touches hearts. But there's another, besides just making the ground fertile, and that is like, how do we make it normal for people to share what's happened to them in the fertile ground? Like, if you think about the Gospels, they're just chock full of stories of people saying, here's where I was, here's when God entered my life, and here's what happened, and here's where I am now. I mean, the whole thing. It's like story after story. These are like built-in testimonies, right? Testimonies are not something, I mean, sometimes I think the Catholic Church is like a little leery of testimony because somehow it makes us another brand of Christianity or something. This is gospel living, and this is gospel proclamation. It happens through people's lives. So if we're proclaiming the gospel to someone and we want them to respond to it, they need to then proclaim the gospel by their lives to someone else. Sherry Waddell in her book said, only disciples make other disciples. So this isn't like we give them a textbook or put them in a class and teach them to become disciples. You can form them if they're already decided that that's the journey they want to be on. But it's how do we normalize where people that are having encounters of faith are sharing that story so other people can hear it? That's why when I talk about strategy, it's not doing the work of God. It's like, in your mind, what you said, Tammy, it's like setting up the field for this. It's like tilling the soil, giving people platforms, celebrating when God does something big, expecting it to happen again, praying specifically for every person to have that kind of encounter. Even when it makes the insiders uncomfortable, it doesn't mean it shouldn't be normal.
let's go back to our alpha. Really, alpha in and of itself isn't evangelistic. It just gives people the structure and the tools so that they can be.
Yes.
Remember, a number of years ago, we had a speaker at St. Benedict, Tammy, you were there, and he said, alpha is evangelization for chickens. It was just one of these things that it's like, yeah, this is just a tool that we have that makes it easier for people to step into this place of evangelization and owning it rather than having to unpack everything and do everything themselves. As you step back from these things, it's realizing that we're partnering with God, we're stepping in, we're depending on the Holy Spirit in all of this, but the Holy Spirit works through us. God wants to use us in this process. He invites us in it. He teaches us. He tells us that he's with us when we do it. And this is an area where we're called to be faithful in. And so learning how to normalize that and encourage that with others and support people in it and challenge them in it. All of that sort of stuff is part of what prioritizing evangelization is. It isn't just simply always the act. It's creating the culture and the environment for it, for people to thrive in it.
So guys, we covered a lot today around prioritization and structure and making sure that the right energy is devoted towards evangelization, including communications and whatnot. For parishes that are out living in this space right now, summarize maybe how they should be taking a stand back and looking at what they're doing to make sure that evangelization is still a priority for them.
Well, I'd say the first thing is for the pastor and the leaders to step back and just evaluate, where's your passion for evangelization? Were you more passionate in the past, and have you kind of allowed that passion to diminish in you? And so what does that look like to kind of rekindle those fires? The other thing I guess I'd say is, where is your fruitfulness currently? Are you moving in that direction? And then is there a place to maybe just pull back and have a strategy session around, okay, what's choking some of this out? What's keeping us from moving forward in this direction? Are there things to get rid of? Have you allowed other busyness to kind of step in and kind of crowd that out? And, maybe there's a place, if they've never done, a little bit of kind of that ministry audit that I shared a little bit earlier from the guidebooks.
Yeah, I think one indicator too for parishes that have been on this journey of evangelization for a while, maybe you've had some phenomenal success like that parish I was mentioning in the middle of the US. There's a few indicators to know, even if you're on the journey, if you've come far enough, if you've kind of gotten stuck, and we'll save that conversation kind of for another session, I'm sure. But if we only reach insiders, eventually for every program, including even a great evangelization platform like Alpha, you'll reach a saturation point. But the way you know that you haven't reached that saturation point isn't just because your numbers go down, but when the right kinds of guests start showing up. Yes, there's as many people in your pews that need to encounter Jesus and maybe even hear the gospel proclaimed for the first time, even if they've been to Mass every day. But outsiders, when they've had an encounter of faith, here's what happens. They invite the right guest to the next one, because outsiders invite other outsiders. And so you start to see this reach beyond the saturation point of in your pews. So maybe just an indicator, like, of the guests coming to your evangelization program or process, is it all the insiders? Do you have enough years yet? Because typically the saturation point could take 3 years to hit. Do you have enough indicators to show you whether you're reaching beyond the walls and have outsiders coming?
Yeah.
Another would be mission beyond the evangelization process. In the Catholic Church, we have great, robust, and even theology around social justice, outreach, social services, ministries to the marginalized. That's one thing the church has done better than anybody in the world, is to reach out. And that's become a lot of times our indicator in the church of what mission looks like. That's an element of it. But I want us to also, if you're doing that really well, and there's a lot of churches that are doing a phenomenal job with that, and I get to coach several of them, how are we doing with the spiritually needy? Not just the physically needy, but the spiritual needy. And that's the target audience for evangelization. So sometimes you could even bring those two worlds together. I've seen this at another parish where they've turned their social services outreach ministry into an evangelization center, where one is not like like eating the other alive, right? Like it's not like we go out to serve the poor and we give them a little prayer card. That's great. That's a great start, but we're not calling that evangelization. How can they both take a priority in your parish if you're doing one well and maybe not the other?
Yeah, that's great. Are we even acknowledging the spiritual hungry outside our own doors like we acknowledge the physical hungry? Guys, what are some next steps that we can give our listeners around restructuring?
Yeah, good question. Because, everybody's at a different place. And some people that have started down this journey might think just hearing the reminder of why they got on the journey in the first place is important. Just to be reminded of the primacy of evangelization, where it fits in parish structure, how we have to keep communicating it. But I would say there's two ways that come to mind when I think about like really looking at our structure, especially those that are on the journey already. And one is kind of an internal and one's a more external. And the internal one is I love dry erase boards. I know Rob does too. I wish he lived closer because I'd give him one for the holidays or his birthday. But I remember so many times in leadership with my team sitting in front of a dry erase board. And it gave us space to write down priorities, to write down the programs, to look at things right. But one thing we did was to put our structure, our internal organizational structure on the board. That was from the pastor and the leadership team and the departments and the people that were in those departments that were running ministries. And it was this great web. And then we just wrote evangelization up in the corner and said, how does our structure say that word? And there's a lot of really clear ways, and you can decide if you're going to use different colored markers, if you're going to erase things, if you're going to reorient, realign, rename, rehire, fire, whatever that looks like. But looking at the structure and then putting the word evangelization as a way to say, is this our priority by the way we're structured? Because one thing we realized in our very large parish in Texas was we had a dozen people employed or ministering in a high leadership capacity in the area of catechesis and formation, and one person in the area of evangelization. Evangelization became its little department with one person. When we looked at the word evangelization and said, does this structure say that we are organized around evangelization? The answer is obviously no. Now that's where the hard work really begins, because you're going to face some challenges at making those changes. So that's one thing I would say is looking internally at the way you're structured and organized. Does it say evangelization is primary, preferential, and preeminent, as St. John Paul II would say? And I think the other shift is more of an external shift, if you will. I mean, it still happens within ministry, but a ministry shift. And that is, what does your beta look like? The post-evangelization stage. Now, the hard part with this is once we start talking about post-evangelization stage, the church does typically a really good job around this, but we're not sure how to tie the two together. That's why I called this beta. It's like for those that have had the gospel proclamation proclaimed to them and they've made a decision to live their lives for Jesus, and they've come to you in faith, and maybe that's through Alpha or some other process where they're now integrated into this life of faith. What do you do with them? Because you don't want them leaving out the back door. But we don't want to spend all of our time figuring that piece out if it's at the detriment of creating the whole evangelization front end. But for some of those on this call, they're really working through now what do we do with all these people that are having encounters of faith in something like Alpha? And that's where I think the beta is something we need to start paying attention to. How do you link this together with some of either your existing processes or programs? How do you create a space around beta? One group of parishioners at my parish in Houston created this space. It wasn't staffers, but it was those that had evangelization hearts and wanted to see the making of the disciples that happen in evangelization. They wanted to see the maturing of disciples happen as a natural next step. So they built this process called Pathways of Renewal, where they've developed a whole system in place that you could almost just rename beta, although they didn't want to live in the same exact space. But that's their way of saying, let's take those that have been made as disciples in evangelization and mature them as disciples in this now discipleship process.
Yeah, how are we still walking with people and maintain that connection? Because here's the reality, Matt. There will people that will come through an Alpha that still won't have an encounter with Jesus. Like, it's not uncommon for to hear stories of people truly coming alive in their faith until they came back to Alpha a second time on the Alpha team and coming out where they still have questions, they're still wrestling with that. To have that next step environment that makes space for that and allows it, that might be kind of a little bit more of a next step, down the path for some, depending on where their beginning point was. But for others, they probably have more questions now than before they started Alpha. Alpha just created more questions. It didn't give them, and so to have that space, I think, is so key to continually fueling the evangelization culture. I think is so important.
So if this conversation challenged you, inspired you, perhaps it's an area you're struggling in, feel free to add some comments in and perhaps start a conversation with some other listeners. We hope that you'll tune in again for another episode as we continue to break down some of these challenges that we're seeing parishes face in the renewal space. Thanks and God bless.